If you grew up in the 1970s, some of the habits you still carry today may feel so ordinary that you barely notice them. You learned to solve small problems without immediately asking for help. You could wait without a screen in your hand. Private family matters often stayed private. Clothes, tools, toys, and household items were repaired, reused, and expected to last. At the time, none of this seemed unusual. It was simply how life worked. But decades later, those same habits may still shape how you handle responsibility, relationships, money, discomfort, time, and independence. You may call it personality. You may even think you were simply born that way. But what if some of these traits are not just personal preferences? What if they are patterns learned so early and repeated so often that they became automatic long after the world that created them disappeared, without you noticing? When people look back on childhood, they often remember the obvious things first: the music, the clothes, the television shows, the cars, the routines. What is easier to miss is the way repeated experiences quietly taught them what to expect from life. Not everyone who grew up in the 1970s had the same childhood, and these patterns were never universal. Family culture, personality, location, and economic circumstances all mattered. But many children grew up in a more analog world with less supervision, fewer instant responses, and more situations they had to navigate for themselves. Over time, repeated routines can become internal expectations about what feels normal, safe, responsible, or necessary. That is what these 7 habits reveal. They include solving problems before asking for help, tolerating boredom, repairing before replacing, waiting for what you want, reading situations independently, keeping emotions and personal matters private, and maintaining relationships without constant contact. None of these habits automatically make someone stronger or better, but together, they can reveal something important about identity. And the first habit may quietly connect many of the others: learning to manage more of life without immediate assistance. One of the strongest habits many people carried forward was simple: try to solve the problem yourself first. For a child with more everyday freedom, small difficulties were often something to work through before calling an adult. A broken toy, a missed bus, a scraped knee, a disagreement with a friend. You looked at the situation, tried something, adjusted, and kept going. Over time, resourcefulness could become more than a skill. It could become part of identity. Even now, asking for help too quickly may feel strangely premature. The same was true of boredom. Without constant digital entertainment, empty time had to be filled from within. You waited. You stared out windows. You wandered outside, invented games, or simply let your mind drift. That did not make every child patient, but it did create repeated practice in being unstimulated without immediately escaping the feeling. Then there was the instinct to make things last. Clothes were patched. Appliances were repaired. Containers were reused. A damaged object was not automatically considered finished. That habit could quietly shape ideas about waste, value, and responsibility. Even decades later, throwing away something that could still be fixed may feel almost wrong. Together, these habits can look purely practical: solve it, tolerate it, repair it. But beneath them is something deeper: a learned expectation that discomfort does not always require immediate relief. And that expectation may also shape desire, risk, and control. Another habit was learning that wanting something did not mean getting it immediately. There were fewer on-demand choices, slower communication, and more natural delays built into everyday life. You waited for a favorite program to come on. You saved for things you wanted. You waited for letters, phone calls, rides, purchases, and plans. Anticipation was not an inconvenience to eliminate. It was simply part of the process. Repeated often enough, that could shape a quiet expectation. Desire and fulfillment do not have to happen at the same time. In adulthood, this may appear as comfort with saving, planning, postponing a purchase, or accepting that something worthwhile may take time. But waiting was only part of it. Many children also had to read situations for themselves. With more unsupervised movement and no instant way to contact an adult, you learn to notice distance, changing weather, unfamiliar people, the mood of a room, when it was time to leave, and whether something felt safe. That kind of judgment was often practical rather than dramatic. You simply paid attention. Years later, what feels like ordinary caution, awareness, or common sense may actually be a deeply rehearsed form of self-management. You learn to wait without demanding immediate relief and to assess circumstances without constant guidance. But independence has another side. A generation that became skilled at managing situations alone often became skilled at managing certain feelings alone, too. Perhaps the most revealing habits are the ones that shaped not what people did, but what they learned to keep inside. For many children growing up in the 1970s, privacy was simply expected. Family problems stayed in the family. Difficult emotions were not always discussed openly, and personal struggles were often handled quietly. That does not mean everyone became emotionally closed. Healthy privacy can be valuable. But when self-containment is practiced repeatedly, it can become an automatic rule. Deal with it yourself before letting anyone else see it. As an adult, someone may be warm, sociable, and deeply caring while still finding it difficult to make their own struggles visible. They can support others easily, yet hesitate when attention turns toward what they need. Relationships were also shaped by a very different rhythm. Friends and relatives could go days or weeks without speaking and still feel connected. There were no read receipts, constant updates, or continuous reassurance that the relationship was intact. That experience may help explain why some adults are comfortable with distance. Silence does not automatically mean rejection. A delayed response does not necessarily signal that something is wrong. Taken together, these habits can create resilience, patience, loyalty, and self-sufficiency. But they can also make constant availability, oversharing, immediate dependence, or throwing things away too quickly feel uncomfortable. None of that makes one generation better than another. The deeper question is how repeated conditions became expectations, and how those expectations eventually began to feel like identity. When you place all 7 habits beside one another, a common pattern begins to appear. Growing up in that environment often meant living with gaps. There was a gap between having a problem and receiving help. A gap between boredom and entertainment. A gap between wanting something and getting it. A gap between something breaking and replacing it. A gap between uncertainty and guidance. A gap between feeling something and talking about it. And sometimes, a long gap between one conversation with someone you cared about and the next. When those gaps are experienced repeatedly, a person learns how to function inside them. You improvise. You wait. You observe. You repair. You keep going. You decide what matters without expecting an immediate response from the outside world. Over time, those repeated behaviors can begin to feel less like habits and more like personality. Patience feels natural. Privacy feels normal. Self-direction feels responsible. Continuity feels more important than constant reassurance. But this does not mean everyone who grew up in the 1970s became the same kind of adult. Family culture, location, personality, money, community, and individual experience created enormous differences. Generational psychology is not destiny. The value of looking backward is not to romanticize the decade or claim one generation was stronger. It is to notice how ordinary environments train behavior long before we realize we are being trained. Some childhood habits disappear when the world changes. Others stay with us so completely that we stop calling them habits at all. We simply call them who we are. Growing up in the 1970s did not create one kind of person. But for many people, everyday life rewarded the same behaviors again and again. Figure it out, wait, make it last, pay attention, keep some things private, and trust that a relationship can survive a little silence. Repeated often enough, those behaviors stopped feeling like lessons. They became normal. And that may be why some of them are still present decades later, even though the world around them has changed completely. Technology changed. Family routines changed. Communication became instant. Entertainment became constant. Replacement became easier. But the expectations learned in childhood did not necessarily disappear with the environment that created them. They may still live quietly inside the way you spend, wait, solve problems, handle emotions, judge situations, and stay connected to other people. Childhood leaves more than memories. It leaves assumptions about how life works. And sometimes, What feels like personality is partly the trace of a world you learned to navigate long ago. So, which of these 7 habits still feels most natural to you? And did you ever realize it might be connected to when you grew up?